Assalamu alaikum and peace. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, which is in Canada, USA, and Mexico, coast to coast, 57 million subscribers, as well as Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Roku TV, and our own website, muslimnetwork.tv. We're there, all these places, 24/7. 1450 years ago today, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was born, and that's the day on which he also left this world. Muslims love him. We don't even utter his name without saying peace be upon him. And we try to follow him every day, all day long. And we are hurt deeply as believers who are in love with someone if someone attacks him or does something which is not very nice. And most of us feel at heart and we just say his name and we say, peace be upon him, and move on. But once in a while, you find somebody who loses his mind and does something which only goes in validating a misperception about Islam and Muslims, that these people, quote unquote, are violent people. That's what happened in Paris. But about 5 years ago, I was in Dallas, and it was a regularly scheduled program. There were about 900 Muslims gathered. It was because of the birthday of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which we are all celebrating. But somehow, several hundred Islamophobes showed up, including Pamela Garrer and Robert Spencers, who have acquired name blaming Muslim and Islam. And a lot of them, according to media report and photographs, have assault rifles with them. So police and FBI, all of them showed up because they were standing right in front. And they had, with long guns on the roof of the auditorium. It was just strange stuff. Program happened peacefully, and we did our program. They did their programs. But then they decided right at the same place to bring an exhibit. They announced an exhibition inviting whole Dallas, Texas, to draw the cartoons of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And Muslim community sat together, what in the world is that? They say, okay, stay quiet about it. So 6 million people live in Greater Dallas area. Only 200 or so people went to see that exhibit. It was a failure. Silence sometimes speaks louder. Patience sometimes is a good response to some ignorant people. It worked until 2 people from out of town showed up and they were shot by the police, and then it became the news. So Islamophobes enjoy that. Muslims were saying, what in the world is that? At this moment, brothers and sisters, as we celebrate the birthday of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, I just picked up the book yesterday and I started reading, picked up encyclopedia, I started researching. So I surrounded myself not only with the praises and supplications for him, but also his memory. And then I went online singing the songs. Throughout the Muslim world, songs of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are being sung. This sometime in a whole week, people will be doing that. So we respect and love. We respect Jesus, peace be upon him as well. Of course, little differently. But can we expect Christians to return respect, if not love, in response to our respect and love? To discuss this with all of you, is someone who has dedicated his life to to bridge, uh, to build bridges of understanding through his scholarship as an anthropologist, as an Islamic scholar, as a diplomat, who even decided to become a filmmaker to create harmony among people. He's no other than Ambassador Akbar Salahuddin Ahmed. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum, Imam Mujahid Sahab. Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome. Ambassador Akbar Ahmed is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies at the American University, Washington, D.C. He's a longtime diplomat for Pakistan and a celebrated scholar throughout the world. Well, thank you so much for sparing your time to be at Muslim Network TV.
My honor, Imam Mujahid Sahab. You're doing a great job. You're enlightening us, both Muslims and non-Muslims, and this is very much needed in the time that we are living in, with so many global challenges that we face as a community and as Americans. These problems are not exclusive to Muslims. The pandemic, the climate change, the ethnic and religious conflict, these are problems that we all share and we must tackle together.
In America, normally people think that hate, fear, and anger is rising. And it used to be quite a bit about Muslim after 9/11 and our neighbors. And you worked very hard on that to try to develop bridges of understanding through different programs and films. And now that America is all busy with election, in which again the hate, fear, and anger from conservative and liberal and Democrats and Republicans and pro-life and pro-choice, and I mean, so many things are putting people apart. And the midst of that, this in France, this people who made cartoon 5 years ago decided to do it again, and unfortunately, somebody went for that bait, and the whole it's déjà vu all over again. So I'm glad not many people in America are talking about, but as a Muslim, I feel a responsibility to say how you can take revenge of a prophet who banned taking revenges by himself. So what is your take? What is happening in France?
Well, Imam Sahab, I have written on Europe, Muslims in Europe, and I have a big chapter on France. France has an ancient history with Islam. Going back to early Islam, remember that when the Muslims crossed over into Andalusia, they actually came almost towards Tours, which is a city or town in France, and almost took it. They were stopped there by Charles Martel, and that changed the history of Europe in a sense. And then, of course, after that came the wave upon wave from the East, the Ottoman Empire, and so on. So there's an ancient history. At the same time, France also has many pluses. People don't know this, and I hope President Macron will be listening to your show and picks this up as a guide to what he can be doing now, because one of his heroes, President Macron's heroes, is Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, Napoleon came to Egypt, if you remember, at the turn of the century. And here's what people don't know. Napoleon had the highest respect for Islam, and especially for the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him. So he dressed in Arab robes. He even took a Muslim name, it is said, Ali. He took Hazrat Ali's name. And that sort of inspired him. He gave dinners where he invited all the sheikhs of Al-Azhar. And he said that one of my greatest inspirations and heroes is the Prophet of Islam, peace be upon him. So here you have one of the greatest Frenchmen, and in France, he's considered one of the national heroes, who understood the world and understanding how to deal with Muslims, reached out with respect and dignity. And I think this is very, very important from leaders who are non-Muslim to reach out to the Muslim community, who are a minority, who are living under a great deal of stress and tension and feeling suppressed. So every time anything happens, people attack or suppress or abuse or humiliate the Muslim community. Now, having said that, we have to be very clear that we must not, as Muslims, condone violence of any kind at any time, because this kind of action every couple of years, every couple of months even, where some non-Muslim is beheaded or killed, is absolutely unacceptable. And let me prove this to you. Imam Sahib, you know the story. A lot of your viewers will not know the story, and it's worth for them to listen carefully to this. People associate violence with Islam. Now, let me give you the story of when the Prophet of Islam comes back to Mecca at the head of a victorious army. He has been ousted from Mecca. He left Mecca. He was almost killed. He was humiliated. They abused him. They did all kinds of things. And in one of the battles, Hind, one of his opponents, actually cut the liver of his favorite uncle Hamza and chewed on it. And Hamza was killed by a warrior slave who was promised freedom called Wahshi ibn Harb, whose object was to kill Hamza and kill him in a very cruel way. So when the Prophet came back to Mecca, people asked each other, what is the Prophet going to do to these two? The Prophet declared an amnesty. He said, I forgive you all. He was very, very kind. In the Quran, he is called a mercy unto mankind. So he forgave people, but he asked to see these two. And everyone was tense. They said, how is he going to respond? After all, he has emotions. He's human like other people, and he has feelings. And Hamza was very, very dear to him. So when this Wahshi began to describe how he killed Hamza, the Prophet started crying. He had tears in his eyes. And yet he forgave him. He did not say, punish him, kill him, chop his head off, because he established that you must always, in any circumstances, your mercy must triumph over your human anger and your human emotions. Now, this is something that is very peculiar and very particular to the Prophet of Islam, but also to the other great figures that we share in our human history and human theology. Jesus Christ was constantly talking about forgiveness, but love and love.
Ambassador, going back to the same story which you mentioned, so Wahshi came, he described in the presence to a person who just conquered whole Makkah and whole army with him. He cried and cried, remembering his dear friend, uncle.
Yes.
And then I think Hind also came, and she was forgiven also.
Forgiven. Right? Both were forgiven.
So this, instead of taking a revenge, his attitude was forgiveness.
And Imam Sahib, this goes back to a point I want to emphasize again and again, and you are playing a role in this. It's very important that the Muslim community understands their own history, that there are crises happening now, but there were crises happening over Muslim history. Go back to the early days of Islam. So many crises, so many attacks on the Prophet, and we have to understand how to respond to these crises. You can't go around chopping people's heads off or throwing bombs at churches or defacing houses of worship of other people. You just can't do that. And when you do that, Muslims must understand every time they do that, it feeds into the activity and the arguments of the Islamophobes. Islamophobe means those people who hate Islam, irrespective of the arguments. They're not interested in what we are talking about. They simply don't like Islam. They may not like Islam because of their ethnicity, because of the region they come from, because of the color of their skin, for whatever reason, but they don't like Islam. And hatred is very dangerous, Imam Sahib. In my study of America, and I spent a year doing this study, I came to the conclusion that it's a slippery slope. So today when you're attacking Muslims, tomorrow you'll attack other minorities. You may attack African Americans or the Jewish community or the Roman Catholic community. And you are seeing this happening in America today. You see the way the African Americans are being attacked, and in the brutal way these young men are being killed. I mean, it's unbelievable. On television, you're actually seeing a human being is being killed simply because of the color of his skin. So hatred is a very dangerous emotion, and it's like a genie in a bottle. When you uncork that bottle, it comes out and very difficult to put back in. That's why Islam emphasizes, as you know, Hamza, again and again and again. And the last great address of the Prophet emphasized, there is no color, no black, no white, no Arab, no non-Arab. So he's dismissing ethnicity and color. And he's saying people must be judged on the merit of their actions, on their virtues, not by the fact that they have a certain color or come from a certain region. These are very great principles. And when does he say this? My God, in the 7th century. It's going to be over 1,000 years before we begin to talk of these things here in the West. And even now, 21st century, you're seeing people being judged by the color of their skin, black or brown, and sometimes precisely because of the color of the skin, they're being gunned down or murdered or have a knee on their necks and throttled to death on our television screens. We really have to begin to think anew about these issues. And I think Muslims have a great deal to contribute, and therefore they need to understand their own history, their own culture, in order to be able to communicate this. Not through anger, not through irrational action, but through scholarship and reasoned argument, and with a desire to improve things, to say, look, this is what we want to share with you. We have a blessing, we want to share it with you.
Thank you so much. You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and we're talking with the Ambassador Akbar Ahmed, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and we're talking with Ambassador Akbar Ahmed. Between Islam and West, you pointed out how Napoleon, such a hero of France, has a very different attitude and try to learn and have relationship, adopted a name Ali, peace be upon him. So, but how the imagination of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, has been historically in the European mind?
Imam Sahib, that's a complicated question. It's not a black or white question. The Prophet is seen as so central to Islam that Western critics calculated, for example, during the Crusades, they calculated that if we attack and focus our attack on this one individual, maybe we'll be able to pull down the structure of Islam. So they launched assault upon assault on the Prophet. Every kind of nonsense, scandal, stories made up about the Prophet. Now, a popular story about the Prophet in the early days was that he was a bishop or a priest who wasn't promoted, and therefore he left the church and started his own religion. So you had all kinds of absurd, blatantly absurd stories like this one. But what we find is that in spite of all these scurrilous stories, you have scholars again and again reaching out, understanding the Prophet, and thinking and writing about him in the highest sense, with highest regard, with highest respect. And there are many, many authors. A French author, Lamartine, for example, in his assessment of the very famous scholar from the 19th century, he writes of the Prophet, and he says, in terms of leadership, religious leadership, he was a commander in the field, he was a lawgiver. He says, with everything considered, there is no one in history, in human history, who can compete with the Prophet in terms of our joint world history. An American professor wrote in the last century, Professor Hart, he called his book The 100, the 100 greatest individuals in history. And he was American, he was a Christian, so people assumed he's going to put Jesus Christ as number one. But he actually put the Prophet of Islam. And again, he explained why. He said that no one in human history has done what the Prophet did in the most difficult circumstances and contributed his contribution to civilization, to history, to the law. And therefore, you see, for example, in the Supreme Court, he's acknowledged. The Lincoln's Inn in London, he's acknowledged as one of the greatest lawgivers. So again and again, where people are rational and they think about matters, they acknowledge him. At the same time, when the critics attack Islam, and I want to make this very clear, especially the Islamophobes, they will then focus on the Prophet, and they think falsely that somehow Muslim faith will weaken, and they don't understand that Muslims revere and love the Prophet, and you use the words in your introduction of love for the Prophet. Muslims are not scared of the Prophet. They don't say, oh, we have the Prophet's followers will whip us or kill us. But they feel for him like they feel for the mother or the father. They have a great deal of respect and love. They don't even just associate him with a ferocious leader of a faith. No, they call him Mehboob-e-Khuda. Mehboob, it's a beautiful word, Mehboob. As you know, Imam Sahib, Mehboob means beloved. The beloved of God. That is how they describe the Prophet. And they feel very much so when he's insulted, as you would be insulted if your mother or father were insulted, they feel that someone very dear to them and near them has been insulted. And therefore, the human reaction is to react and react with anger. That is where we must, leaders like you, must appeal to the Muslim community not to translate that anger if someone does attack the person or the character or the reputation of the Prophet through anger, but explanation. Talk to them about how he treated Vaishi and how he treated Hind, that the two people who were really his enemies and who tortured him, and how he must have gone through that agony of thinking what happened to his uncle Hamza. In spite of that, he forgave them. So those are things I think that would help us understand the character. Now, those people who continue to attack Islam, continue to attack the Prophet, continue to attack Muslims, you can only pray for them, that they see the light, that someday they themselves will come to a better understanding and try to improve the world. We are living in a very difficult time of history. Try to improve the world and not make it a worse place by adding fuel to the fire.
Scholars in last 100 years, Rose Wilder Lane of the, sources of freedom. She also mentions Prophet Muhammad as second most important source of liberty and freedom in the world. But when the European scholarship began about Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was it very early or it is all connected with Crusades?
I would say that the Crusades came with a purpose. Their purpose was to take back the Holy Lands from the Muslims, simple as that. And after 2-3 centuries, they failed and they returned. So that was the end of that. But the impact was, and I've noticed this about Islam as a historian, as a scholar, that when Islam is under attack, it reels, it's thrown off balance, but then it comes back with its faith renewed. It doesn't easily abandon its faith. This is a very interesting phenomenon. There's a famous saying in our part of the world, Imam Mujahid, Islam zinda hota hai har Karbala ke baad, that every time there's a Karbala, the Muslims have been wiped out, they've been martyred like Hazrat Hussein, and in the case of that terrible episode when the Prophet's grandson was martyred with so many members of his family. That renews Islam. There's a renewal of Islam, of faith, of belief, and it adds a kind of a dynamic to faith itself, because without that kind of pain, faith is difficult to realize in real lives. Like Jesus on the cross, again, you feel for the pain, you feel for the agony he goes through, and you identify with that. And his answer, Jesus' answer, if you recall, is forgive them, for they know not what they do. Again, forgiveness. So the Prophet became a target. And now after 9/11, with the uncertainty around Islam, what is Islam? Why do they hate us, as President Bush asked famously? You have a lot of the Islamophobes being opportunistic and picking up this atmosphere and then again targeting it on the Prophet. And you have a lot of these nonsensical books attacking the Prophet. But what that did was, again, my point about inadvertently people discussing Islam and attracting followers to Islam. A lot of people began to read about Islam, began to read about the Quran, and a lot of conversions took place and are taking place. So that initiative to attack Islam also backfired. So I would say Muslims need to be much cooler, much more studied, much more scholarly, and much more Islamic in their reactions, and not just go out into the streets and start breaking things and shouting and abusing and killing or attacking people. That's not the Islamic way. Unfortunately, it has become the Islamic way and is widely seen as the Islamic way, as you'll see the mobs in the streets.
I agree with you, Professor, that it is widely seen as the Islamic way. But how come, two persons doing something becomes such a big news, and rest of the whole community and all the mosque opposing, criticizing does not become the news? So you being a filmmaker, how come silence of the silent majority opposing that, how they could be vocal enough on these things?
When when I was traveling in the United States for the film and book I wrote, A Journey into America, People ask me this question. They said, well, 9/11 happened. We didn't hear Muslims objecting. And I said, as far as I know, all the major capitals of the world, Cairo, in Iran, in Pakistan, in Egypt, everywhere the major universities and mosques condemned what happened. Because no Muslim would say innocent people should be killed. That is not Islam. And the problem was, where was it reported? Why weren't people covering it? So people like you would be able to say things again and again. Were you being covered on the mainstream media? Were you on CNN? Were you on Fox? You were not. So that people did not know what mainstream Muslims were saying or reacting. And as you said, if two Muslims do something wrong, it'll be all over the place. Now, having said this, we must be fair. I interviewed amongst many, many very, very distinguished people, Jews, Muslims, Christians in Europe for my project on Muslims in Europe. One of the most impressive was a very famous rabbi, chief rabbi of Denmark. And I asked him, I said, you've had this great experience of Denmark. What do you have to comment on Muslims and how can we, Muslims in Europe, be better integrated and better accepted? Here's the point he made. He said, number one, if one Jew does something wrong, one Jewish figure commits some crime or breaks the law, people are going to say, you see, this Jewish man did this. All Jews are like this. The whole community is going to be blamed, number one. Number two, he said, we arrived in Denmark and we set up a school. So I said, set up a school to understand your own faith and remind people of your own faith. He said, no. It was to understand Denmark and Danish culture and Danish language. And he said, today the best writers in Danish are Jewish writers. Thirdly, he said, we emphasize that you have rights as a minority, you have rights, you are protected, but so does the majority. You can't simply impose your rights as a minority over the majority. I thought these three were very good points, Imam Sahib, and I would be grateful if you thought about these 3 points. And they were given to me in sincerity. It was a personal interview. It's in my film, Journey into Europe, but it was one-to-one, one-on-one interview. So these are 3 points I thought that we could benefit from. And I don't think we benefit from this because we are facing problems in each one of these points. And you will see very often we set up schools, lots and lots of schools, which is great, excellent. But we are not understanding or reading or coming to grips with the majority. For example, in Germany, there were so many very nice Islamic schools, but the imams could not even speak German because they came straight from Turkey. They were great imams. They were very good, very learned, but they had no idea of Germany. So when the young generation talked to them, and the young generation, you know it, Imam Sahib, we were all young once, in my case, many, many years ago. And these youngsters have problems. You see, their problems today are teenagers. Problems are drugs, dancing, dating. These are live issues for them. We have no idea how to deal with it. The old imams coming from Turkey cannot talk to them. It's a different language, a different culture. The result is the young are very vulnerable. It's like shields. Shields have been taken over. What is the shield of the young generation? It is the parents and the imams. So right now, a lot of the youngsters don't have that shield. Many of the cases that, and I wrote case studies, these youngsters, 18, 19 years old, they had no one to talk to them. Even their parents would reject them for all sorts of sociological reasons. So these youngsters would go to the basement, go online, and online, the whole world opens up. And a lot of the world out there is scary. So they very quickly they're talking to some so-called sheikh in the Middle East or in South Asia, who very quickly can guide them or misguide them into ways that would damage them and the community. So these are huge issues, Imam Mujahid, and I'm so glad that you're raising them. And I hope our community can then pick some of these burning issues in society and then tackle them.
Thank you so much. You're watching Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid, and I'm talking with Professor Akbar Ahmed, and we'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Muslim Network TV. This is Imam Malik Mujahid. I'm talking with Ambassador Akbar Ahmed. Ambassador, this whole blasphemy law, what was European conception and practice of blasphemy laws, and how it was transported to the Muslim lands?
Well, first of all, Imam Sahib, we must understand, Muslim lands were colonized. In the 19th century, European colonizers conquered more or less most of the Muslim world. So South Asia was under the British. Now, in 1857, as you know, there was a huge movement among Indians, Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs, which almost toppled the British Empire. And this movement began, again, as you know, it's a very famous story, by the British introducing a new kind of cartridge for their guns. They wanted their soldiers to have the best weapons. Now, this cartridge involved cutting the covering of the bullet. And the rumor spread, by no doubt people who didn't want the British in India, the rumor spread that this cartridge was covered by some leather which had the fat of the cow and the pig. So at one go, if you did this and tore it off before putting the bullet in the barrel of the gun, you were offending. If you're a Muslim, you were offended. If you're a Hindu, you were offended. So that began to create disquiet, then unrest, then anger, and eventually it sparked what was called the First War of Independence, or the Great Mutiny, whichever way you want to look at it. After this movement, the British realized that you cannot interfere with people's culture. So they brought out all kinds of laws to ensure that culture and religion would be off limits. So you can do whatever you want to do in terms of law and order to suppress a rebellious movement against the crown, against the British crown, but do not interfere with people's private cultural and religious practices. So the blasphemy law was put in place to say that anyone blaspheming against a religion would be punishable, very severe punishments. And once Pakistan was created, for example, that law remained on the books, on the legal and law books. And these are laws that we are, in a sense, in the Muslim world.
Ambassador, what are the bases? Did Europe has blasphemy laws? Where this whole concept comes from?
I think in Europe, people are now, in many countries, people are very sensitive about religion and hatred. And again, there's some element of ambiguity because there's certain laws that have been specifically formulated. For example, after the Second World War, for example, you cannot challenge or question the Holocaust. And I know that in some countries in Europe, that is then punishable under the law, because that leads to hatred against the Jewish community. And we saw what that hatred led to in the 1930s in Europe. So but Europeans are naturally very...
Those are laws against hate. But blasphemy towards Christianity and this whole Catholic and Protestant conflict, is there a history of blasphemy law in Europe?
Yes, because remember that for 1,000 years, Europe was very Christian. And Christianity was preserved and guarded very jealously. So, and a lot of the wars, a lot of the history of Europe from, I would say, the 14th century to the 17th, 18th century is nothing but a religious war. Protestants fighting Catholics and mass killings, really mass killings. You cannot imagine the scale of the wars and the scale of the killings and the brutalities and the cruelties. So by the 18th, 19th centuries, Europeans decided that if they wanted to progress, if they wanted their continent to progress, they must set aside religion. So religion was then slowly moved aside to a margin, and you had the great industrial period of progress in the 19th century and all the great achievements that the West really was involved in, and that put the West right on top of the pile of international regions of the world.
This understanding of secularism, say in US, the way we understand and the way French understand, or the French Constitution enshrines, what's the difference between these two understandings?
Very, very good point. Very good point. In France, because France went through this experience in a very, very terrible way, with a lot of bloodshed. As I pointed out, there were the Protestants, the Huguenots, then there were the Catholics, and there were brutal fights between the two. So by the time of the French Revolution and the coming of Napoleon, they decided that religion would be a private matter. The state would not be involved. So Napoleon, if you remember, took the crown and crowned himself. Now, normally the Pope would come and crown the ruler or the emperor of France. So here Napoleon was saying, no, we individuals, the citizen must be in charge of his own destiny and his own fate. So the notion of laïc, L-A-I-C-E, became embedded in French culture and in French thought. So anything that compromises laïcité, which means compromising pure secularism. So religion must stay out of your normal life, and the matters of state must be completely laïc, which means that no religion, whether Catholic or Muslim or Jewish, is allowed. Even the Jewish community cannot have their symbols on them. Now, along come the Muslims, and why do they come into the picture? Because after the First World War and the Second World War, we discovered that France had crossed onto the African continent and colonized North Africa, particularly Algeria. So those huge countries colonized by France, and that was not a good experience, Imam Sahib, very sad experience, because the French there had forgotten Napoleon Bonaparte's philosophy of colonization. This new form of colonization was brutality. It was called the administration of the saber. The saber means the sword. So people were just slaughtered, imams were slaughtered, landlords, the elders, literally thousands and thousands. It was very, very bitter. That's why the War of Independence for Algeria against France was one of the bitterest in world history. And I think 1 or 2 million people died in fighting that war. So the concept of laïcité now remains in France, and the refugees and immigrants and labor begins to arrive from North Africa after the Second World War. And there you are set up for the clash that you're seeing. Because if you're coming from Algeria, you're coming with your own culture, your own religion, your own tribal ways, especially tribal ways are also very important for North Africans. And here you are running straight into a very consciously laïc society, which was French society. And that conflict has not been resolved. And here President Macron is not understanding that in his society, he has not one kind of community, he's got 2 or 3 different kinds of communities. And he needs to incorporate them all and embrace them all in order to find a solution to moving forward. He cannot simply go down heavy on one community and hope that through arrests and torture and killing and jailing people that the solution will go, problem will disappear. It won't. The problem will remain until he finds a solution. And maybe, as I pointed out, the solution is in Napoleon Bonaparte's attitude to other cultures and not to the 21st attitude, which is just use a sledgehammer and go and hit other people.
As Ambassador, religion and state being separate. I mean, we practice in a particular way in the United States as well. And there's it is enshrined in our Constitution. We have laws about that, and we have freedom of religion thoroughly. But in France, it seems like it is not as much as separation as a state control of religion. I'll give you one example. I don't know, I haven't studied their constitution. I've studied other constitution, but not the French constitution. I was in UK for some think tank meeting on behalf of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And from there, suddenly plan became that French government wants us to go and see them. So went there for a few days. We have meeting with government officials and ministers and here and there. And they took us to a council of Islamic organizations. So we were talking in that mosque with the leader, and I was quite impressed what he was telling me. So I said, can I see your bylaws? So he looked towards me and said, oh, you just came from that minister. He has the bylaws. I said, why he has the bylaws? He said, because he wrote them.
But Imam Sahib, there are many discrepancies. In my studies, I found French are very humanitarian. It's a great civilization. It's not like the Anglo-Saxon civilization. In its own way, the French civilization is really global. It has a vision of the world and very humanitarian. At the same time, there's some things that they just don't see which are creating problems. Did you know, for example, that Marseille, which is the second city of France, the second biggest city, which has almost 1 million Muslims living in it from North Africa. Do you know there's not a single communal central mosque? Just think of it, what I've told you. So these are realities. And if I were to advise the administration, I would say, please set up a mosque so that you know what's going on, so that you have someone to talk to, someone who can guide you on how to deal with the community. How can you deal with them blindly? You don't know where they are, where they're living, who are the troublemakers, who are the good people, who should you be working with? None of this. Because we must remember, you mentioned America. Now, in my study, I discovered one thing about the United States. The United States had created, the first time in world history, first time, a vision of a genuinely plural society. Go back to 1770s and go back to the University of Virginia, which was created by Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, one of the great founding fathers of America. Now, just outside the campus, there's a beautiful statue of an angel standing with Jefferson. The angel is holding a plaque, a tablet. And the tablet says religious freedom, 1776. And then it says religious freedom. Now think of what I'm going to tell you. Then it says God. God is for Christians. Yahweh for the Jewish faith. Allah. And I was so shocked when we were studying this and looking at it. I told my American team, they hadn't seen it. And I said, just look at this. Jefferson is welcoming as a key notion of religious pluralism the followers of Allah. And this is in the late 18th century. And look at what's happening in the rest of the world. You have France, where the kings of France, the Louis and so on, said we are the sun king. They would say we are descended from the sun. Japan and China, they said we are actually offspring of the universe and the planets of the universe. Here you have a group of founding fathers who are wise, who are compassionate, who are embracing all the faiths. Because under Allah, you then had Brahma. So here they are also embracing other faiths like Hinduism. And I said, could they even imagine that there'd be Hindus in America and the United States at that time? So the notion of religious pluralism is the definition of America. And when Jefferson writes up his headstone at his grave, it's worth seeing. He doesn't mention, he writes it himself. So he doesn't mention that he was president of the United States. But he mentions that he wrote and visualized the statute of religious pluralism for his state and created the university. You see his set of priorities. So the notion of religious pluralism becomes the heart of American identity. And I would like, Imam Sahib, I'm sorry to say this, I would like Americans to understand this a bit better, because they don't seem to understand how crucial to them is the idea from the founding fathers of an American identity, which is colored by this beautiful concept of embracing the universe.
Well, I hope we continue to, I sometimes feel, Professor Ahmed, that, just like Prophet, peace be upon him, has said that Iman does not stay at one level, it goes up or goes down. Similarly, I think our freedoms and our democracy constantly require struggles to be able to strengthen our values on which the society is established. And right now in the election season, that's what I hope we do it peacefully and respectfully and continue to grow in the direction which was envisioned by forefathers, as you mentioned. Going back to France, you mentioned that second largest city with 1 million Muslim does not have a mosque. Is it a law which is prohibiting that, or Muslims are too poor to have one?
I asked a good question. I asked many of the Muslims, and I asked the administration of the town. And the answers are very interesting, because they said, the administration said, well, we are ready to give a plot of land if the Muslims can unite and come up with a plan for a mosque and raise the money. Now, the Muslims also have a problem, as you know, they very often have internal fights, internal conflicts, ego problems. I am the chief, I am the imam, I am the leader. And that's what's happening. So you have the Algerians saying, no, it will be our mosque. Tunisians saying, no, it will be our mosque. Moroccans saying, no, we'll design it our way and we'll have an imam from Morocco. So the tension within the community, the lack of funding, they haven't been able to raise so much money, and the administration, which is sort of lukewarm, all that combines to the reality that one of the biggest, second biggest city of France does not have a mosque. Now, having said that, let me also point out, to the credit of France, that I visited the Great Mosque of Paris, which was built before the Second World War. It's a beautiful, beautiful mosque. Beautiful mosque in the style of the Moroccan architecture, Andalusian architecture. Beautiful mosque with a courtyard and a little fountain in the middle of the courtyard. And I used to, when I was visiting it as a student in the early 60s, I'd go there to pray, and I'd have a peaceful afternoon just praying there, sitting there, just thinking of spiritual matters. And I would often say, what a beautiful place of peace right in the middle of the hurly-burly of Paris. So that's also France. So France has to remember its own greatness and its own glory. And remember that these Muslims living in France today are French, and they need to be loved, and they need to be welcomed, and they need to be recognized. And those who break the law, those who do things that upset not only the French society, but their own community, need to be singled out, need to be punished according to the law, and the community as a whole must be helped and guided to find a way of living in harmony in France itself.
Not very far is that beautiful looking design of Islamic museum there as well.
Yes.
Well, but what is, but the current administration there are making strange statements, Islam of enlightenment, and we thought Islam is the enlightenment, and that saying that they're not going to give up on these things. And so
Imam Sahib, again, I have to interfere here. If you don't mind, I want to jump in. You see, this argument exasperates me, because these people who look at Islam and they say, you must be like us, become enlightened. They need to be told that the very notion of enlightenment is coming from Islam. They need to be told that the great scholars of Islam like Ibn Rushd, Arabi, Al-Ghazali, Ibn Sina, they were the ones who actually fed into the notion of the Enlightenment in Europe, which went on to instruct American independence and the great Constitution and the Declaration, which were influenced by Thomas Jefferson, who was influenced by John Locke, who in turn was influenced by Arabic writers and philosophers. And again, I mentioned this in my own book. This is important because when people say, well, we want you to be enlightened, they have to be told, why don't you read your own history and understand that that enlightenment is coming from Islamic scholars. Let me give you a concrete example, because people will not even accept what I'm saying. Ibn Rushd or Averroes, Ibn Rushd is called Averroes in Western literature. He came up, and he's not alone, whether it's Ibn Sina, Avicenna, or Ibn Arabi. Philosophers and writers were really writing and working out how to live in this world, how to balance your faith, your religion, your iman with progress and science and logic. Two things which were seen by the church as incompatible. But within Islam, they were seen as compatible. So Ibn Rushd established, after studying Aristotle and Plato, he was the great scholar of the Greeks, that this was perfectly compatible. And this logic and argument made a huge impact on St. Thomas Aquinas, the greatest scholar in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. So much of an impact that Thomas Aquinas did not even mention Ibn Rushd's name. He was so much in awe of him. He would quote him, but he would just say, as the commentator says. Think of it. He's not even quoting him. He simply said, as the commentator says. So Ibn Rushd is the commentator. Now you may say, well, Akbar, what proof have you got of this? Look at the moon. There's a crater on the moon which honors by name Ibn Rushd. Look at the painting of Raphael, the most famous painting of the Renaissance period, the school of Athens, which with Plato and Socrates at the heart. And there you will see, included in the portrait of these great Greeks and Christian philosophers, Ibn Rushd. Now, Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, again, Ibn Rushd, he honors him. Even as a Muslim, he sends everyone to hell, but Ibn Rushd gets an honor as a scholar. So these were scholars that made a huge impact on Europe, mainstream Europe. We unfortunately are not aware. We're living through the pandemic. How many people know that Ibn Sina, or Avicenna as he's called in the West, actually came up with the idea of the quarantine? It was his idea. He's a great medical, one of the geniuses of medical science. His book on medicine was taught up to the 17th century. How do we know about these things? We don't. This was in Europe. His book was taught in Europe for 500 years. And his contributions to understanding the pandemic were crucial for us to deal with the pandemic. The first being social distancing, isolation, masks. This is all coming straight from Avicenna. So again, for us,
thank you so much, Ambassador Akbar Ahmed. We ran out of time, but we will have you again.
Thank you, Imam Sahib. Please carry on your struggle of enlightenment, true enlightenment.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Sherdil Khan and Dr. Abdul Wahid for producing today's show. You're watching Muslim Network TV on Galaxy 19 satellite, Amazon Fire TV, Raku, and our own website, muslimnetwork.tv.
Thank you, Imam Sahib. I'd like to thank your team, Sherdil and Wahid Sahib. You're doing a great job. You're doing a great service in this time and age. And I'm very honored to be on your program. Thank you.
Peace. Salam.
Salam. Salam alaikum.